Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to open the 25th International Meeting of Mine Action National Directors and United Nations Advisors, or NDM, as we've been calling it for so many years. Before we hear from our opening speakers, I'd like to invite you to observe a moment of silence to honor explosive ordnance victims, children, women, and men from affected communities, peacekeepers, humanitarian workers, as well as our friends and colleagues from our sector who've lost their lives protecting others. Could we just stand for a moment? Thank you. I'm really delighted and pleased that we're all here together in Geneva. I think the mood seems buoyant and very happy. So I'd like to welcome all of you who are here, but also the friends who are joining us online. And of course, I have to thank again and again the government of Switzerland for hosting us and for generously supporting this year's NDM. We have a special guest of honor with us today, and I'm delighted to be able to give the floor to the Director General of our UN office here in Geneva, Ms. Tatiana Valovaya, who's going to welcome us to Geneva and officially launch our discussions. You should know that the UN office in Geneva is our UN humanitarian and disarmament hub, which is of course why UNMAS has a footprint here. And we're very grateful to the Director General for housing the UNMAS office that some of you visited already this week, and for graciously sharing her time with us today. Madam Director General, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends. It is a pleasure to participate in this year's meeting of Mine Action, National Directors and UN Advisors. I want to welcome you all to Geneva as we celebrate the opportunity to gather in person. A warm welcome also to those joining us virtually. I thank Switzerland, our host country, and steadfast support of international cooperation and mine action globally. I thank the World Intellectual Property Organization for sharing this beautiful space with us for this meeting while we renovate the Palais des Nations, and I am absolutely sure that we will have next meetings in our renovated Palais des Nations when it's back to normal way of functioning. And of course, I congratulate Ms. Eileen Kohn, recently appointed by the Secretary General as the Director of UNMAS. I am confident that under her leadership, UNMAS will continue to work in partnerships to design and deliver effective mine action programs and promote universalization of humanitarian disarmament treaties. To the Mine Action National Directors, after years of difficulty around both the pandemic and an increase in the number of mine victims, I am encouraged that so many of you were able to travel and gather here to share best practices and steps towards the days without the plague of mines and explosive devices. Millions of people live in areas contaminated by explosive ordnance. Mines, explosive remnants of war, and improvised explosive devices injure and kill thousands of people every year. Mine action is essential to protect people, restore humanitarian access, and enable people to resume income-generating activities, in particular subsistence farming. Demining is dangerous and costly, but indispensable for countries to progress and communities to thrive. Unfortunately, mine action around the world suffers from inconsistent and variable funding. This annual 25th anniversary meeting of NDM-UN provides a unique opportunity for mine action stakeholders to reflect upon and access good practices, renew collective commitments to address continued challenges, and revitalize collaborative efforts to safeguard countries and communities against these deadly devices. This year's theme, Safe Ground, Safe Steps, Safe Home, invites us to engage local actors and communities in protecting men and women, boys and girls, and promoting inclusive, local, and durable solutions. Safe Ground is the title of the global campaign to turn minefields into playing fields, which was launched by the UN Secretary-General in 2019. Safe Steps bring attention to the trepidation that too many people experience when they move about, not knowing if they will detonate an explosive that could maim or kill them at any moment. And Safe Home is about restoring the personal security of individuals and communities in post-conflict settings. Among this year's plenaries, there is one on equality, diversity, and inclusion. This issue is particularly dear to me as an international gender champion, and given the recent launch of a working group on addressing racism in the UN Geneva. The Mine Action community must ensure that its work brings together diverse voices within and across sectors, civil society, government representatives, and the wider UN community to share knowledge and invest in solutions. In order to create safe ground, safe steps, and safe homes, we must embrace a more inclusive, diverse, and equitable community as Mine Action stakeholders. I wish you fruitful discussions during this meeting, and on behalf of the United Nations, thank you for your continued commitment to this important cause. Next time, I hope to welcome you in the Palais des Nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Director General. We're all looking forward to meeting in the Palais, but we also appreciate the fact that this is a really beautiful venue this year. So thank you for the kind words addressed to me, and thank you for your strong statement in support of Mine Action as indispensable for countries to progress and for communities to thrive. We, of course, share your concern about the funding gaps and your commitment to an inclusive, diverse, and equitable Mine Action community. At this time, it's my honor to introduce His Excellency Ambassador Felix Baumann, Permanent Representative of Switzerland to the Conference on Disarmament. I want to congratulate Switzerland on the country's election to serve on the UN Security Council in 2023 and 2024. Switzerland has an unwavering commitment to Mine Action that's been demonstrated in all of the UN legislative bodies, and we are just delighted to have another friend of Mine Action serving on the Security Council. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Secrétaire Général Adjoint.
Dear Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General, dear UNMAS directors, excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to Geneva. This is with real pleasure after this long pause due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is with a real pleasure, and I'm really delighted to welcome you during this 25th NDM-UN 25. I'm delighted that we can have a face-to-face meeting. So this is the 25th time that this meeting has occurred, and this is giving us this year once again the opportunity to create and to care about our networks, to together face challenges we have to fight against. And this is extremely crucial. Dear ladies and gentlemen, as a representative of the state, this is a specific honor for me once again to welcome you here in Geneva. I also would like to thank UNMAS for organizing this event, namely the Geneva office, Mr. Bruno Deva, and all his team for this excellent collaboration we can use. And also, I would like to thank WIPO organization for kindly agreeing to welcome this NDM-UN 25 in their offices, despite the fact that there are different in-house meetings occurring right now. There's no better place, more appropriate for this meeting than here in Geneva, in this city, which is the place where the global actions were born. Geneva is regrouping most of the main stakeholders when it comes to humanitarian clearance, mine clearance. As you know, Convention on Conventional Weapons, CCAC, such as conventions between on prohibition of munitions have been born here. Also, we have different organizations, specific agencies of the UN system, also the International Committee of Red Cross, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent. Also, non-NGOs, important NGOs, have their headquarters here in Geneva, in the city of peace, as we call it. Also, with the International Center for Humanitarian Land Clearance, GICHD, we have a competence excellence center which is recognized everywhere in the world. So Geneva's role is embedded in Switzerland's commitment when it comes to fighting against weapons, mines. Swiss is fully involved into fighting against mines. It's been more than 25 years. At the beginning of 2022, few weeks only, the Swiss government has just adopted for the first time a strategy of the government to fight against mines and to clear mines, because conventional weapons, fighting against them is one of 5 different themes they want to fight against. And you've said it, Mrs. Director, and thank you for your kind words. As a member, non-permanent member, elected member of the Security Council from next year on, Switzerland will remain firmly involved against mines. And we will try to be an addition in this fight against mines in favor of peace. And once again, Excellencies, dear colleagues, I thank you all for agreeing to travel here to Geneva, and I wish to all of you fruitful exchanges during these 2 days. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Baumann, and let me again thank you for hosting, for supporting this meeting, and of course we'll continue our collaboration with you here in Geneva, in New York, and in the field where we have the benefit of quite a few in-kind Swiss experts working with UNMAS programs. Now, at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Jean-Pierre Lacroix, the Undersecretary General for Peace Operations and the Chair of the UN Interagency Coordination Group for Mine Action. And unfortunately, he can't be here in person, but he sent a video message, and I would welcome you conveying your attention here to the screen where we will hear that message.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, warm greetings to everyone attending the 25th meeting of Mine Action National Directors and United Nations Advisors. I thank the government and people of Switzerland for hosting this event and UNMAS for organizing it. This meeting marks several milestones in the history of mine action. It has been 20 years since the International Mine Action Standards were adopted, 25 years since UNMAS was established, 30 years since UNDP and UNICEF started their work in mine action, and 30 years since the civil society activists launched their campaign to ban landmines. We recognize the important work by civil society members, NGOs, public figures, and diplomats which made the Mine-Man Treaty a reality. We salute the sacrifice and steadfast determination of mine action professionals in this room and across the world. Capable and competent national mine action entities, which many of you represent, own and lead national mine action efforts. As a sector, you have cleared tens of thousands of square kilometers of land, and you have provided millions of people with life-saving explosive ordnance risk education. We've made important progress, yet we cannot be complacent. Safe ground, safe steps, and safe home still remains elusive for millions in affected countries. Over 12,000 people lost their lives to explosive ordnance accident in 2021 in some 30 countries where the United Nations has a mine action presence. 81% of these casualties were civilians. We see new significant contamination in Ethiopia, Myanmar, Ukraine, Yemen, and many other countries. The increasing use of improvised explosive devices by bad actors is causing mounting peacekeeper and civilian casualties. This also impacts the safe deliveries of humanitarian assistance and delays long-term reconstruction and state-building efforts. This meeting is an opportunity to build stronger partnerships between governments, civil society, and the United Nations system, and to move forward towards our common objective of a world free of explosive ordnance threat. I wish you a productive meeting ahead. Thank you for your work and dedication in ensuring that the world is a safer place for communities all over the world.
I think we all agree with Mr. Lacroix that this is a meeting that will allow us to build and strengthen our partnerships across government, across civil society, and across the UN system with all of our partners. So at this time, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. And she is Dr. Katrine Finnsnes, Weapon Contamination Medical Advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross. The presence of qualified emergency medics can mean the difference between life and death for explosive ordnance victims, as we all know. And our keynote speaker is, as I said, with the ICRC's Weapon Contamination Medical Advisor, and she's been responding to complex emergencies across the globe since her first experience dealing with a multiple casualty event after an explosion at a marketplace in Afghanistan, when she was an anesthetic trainee. She's an anesthesiologist, and for the last 10 years, she's been sharing her time between anesthesiology, pre-hospital and humanitarian work with the ICRC, with Médecins Sans Frontières and other organizations, and she's agreed to share her experiences with us. Dr. Finnsnes, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Director Eileen Cohn, for that lovely introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm Katrine. I've been invited here to share some of what I witnessed, to bring attention to the victims of mines, improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and unexploded ordnances from a different perspective. Over the years, I've seen how the horrors of war changes the lives of people forever. I'll talk about the innocent people caught up in the conflict, often the children that suffer the consequences of explosions. I'm grateful to the organizers for putting a focus on why we are here and to remind you all of the importance of your work. So thinking of patients that I have encountered with explosive injuries, Afghanistan springs to mind first. Over 10 years ago, I left the Norwegian autumn and was looking forward to some sun and heat. I came to the northern parts of Afghanistan in Kunduz, which was even more cold. A glass of water froze on my nightstand table. Now, this explosion you mentioned, we had a little girl come in, Fahima. She was about 7 years old, and she came in as part of a multiple casualty incident. That means that we're having many patients coming at the same time, and we need to get all hands on deck to prioritize and treat, to try and save as many as possible. In this case, there'd been an explosion of an IED at the local marketplace. We didn't know it at the time when she came in, but her mum had been killed in the same explosion. Now, we triage Fahima as red, which means that we considered her to have serious, life-threatening injuries, but were potentially salvageable. So she got a tube in her chest in the emergency department to help her breathing, as her lung was punctured from shrapnel that had gone through from the back of her chest, through her lung, through her diaphragm, and into her liver. In the operating theatre, we found that she had a lot of blood in her stomach. But with packing and blood transfusions, she's somewhat stabilized. I had to help her breathing for the first day, but the next day she was able to breathe on her own. You can show the first picture there, please. relatives from her extended family came to sit with her. She was gradually recovering physically, but she was obviously mentally very traumatized. Next picture. She wouldn't talk, but she would sit and fill sheet after sheet with little doodles with the crayons that she'd received. So a couple of weeks later, when it came time to remove her sutures, I figured I'd try to avoid traumatizing her further by giving her another anesthetic inside the ICU, as she was like a patchwork blanket. This went uncomplicated. She slept peacefully for about an hour, but then I noticed out of the corner of my eye that her breathing isn't normal. Her airway is blocked, so I go over to open her airway with the usual maneuvers, and as I do so, I see a worm protruding from her mouth. Next picture, please. Now, she had a 30-centimeter long Ascaris worm that doesn't like it very much when its host is being poisoned by anesthetic drugs, so was trying to escape through the mouth. Now, I didn't know a whole lot about parasites at the time, but I was working with a great team who enlightened me. So a couple of weeks later, Bahima recovered, and she could be discharged home without her worms, but with all her limbs intact. Next, please. That wasn't the case for, no, back again. Thanks. Sorry. That wasn't the case for the little curious boy Muhammad, who came to us without most of his right hand. And I intended here to have a warning before you were seeing the next picture, because the next picture is very graphic. But this is the realities of war and the realities of explosive injuries. But I do appreciate that some of you may need to look away. You may go to the next picture now. Now, he'd picked up something that went boom, according to his brother. Fortunately, his brother was unharmed, and Muhammad himself did not have any other serious injuries. And he's so young, he can become quite dexterous with his left hand. Also, he's a boy. Next. I returned to Bakwa in Farah province in Afghanistan last year. This was two very different projects in the same country, but unfortunately, explosive injuries were prevalent in both. We had a little girl come in to us in Bakwa who had a nondescript history of injury, but it was clear to us from the way her injuries looked that she had suffered some explosive injury. Now again, I advise those of you who do not want to see a graphic picture to please look away. Next picture, please. She was peppered with shrapnel.
كانت الشظايا متناثرة على وجهها وخسرت ذراعا. العيادة كانت صغيرة للغاية ولذا حاولنا تحقيق استقرارا وحتى ننقلها لعلاج لاحق، وسمعنا لاحقا أنها قد شفت وتم عودتها إلى منزلها.
It will be even more difficult for her, especially when she grows up and becomes of marriageable age. Next, please. Nigeria is another place where we received a lot of victims with explosive injuries. I was based in Maiduguri, which is up north in Borno State. And just in the outskirts of Maiduguri, there was a settlement of internally displaced people. Now, the people living in this camp had already been displaced by insurgents in the Lake Chad area, but they were still not safe when they were now inside this camp. During the time I was there was almost weekly explosions by body-borne IEDs, supposedly activated by Boko Haram. Now, sometimes we get a notification that there'd been an explosion, so we start to prepare for a lot of work, but we wouldn't get any because most people were already dead. Or the person who had activated the explosives had done so in a relatively isolated area, as maybe they hadn't wanted to be in that position to begin with. But sometimes we did get a lot of casualties coming through, and we did need to activate our multiple casualty plan. One of the victims that came through in such an incident was a father and a husband. He had an injury to his leg that resulted in something called compartment syndrome. It means that his leg, because of the injury, it was swelling, but there's only so much space to accommodate a swelling in a leg. Eventually, the blood flow is cut, the leg becomes ischemic, and he ended up with an amputation. Now, he's a farmer, and his wife and his kids were lightly injured in the same explosion. So I do worry for their future, even if they do get to return to their land. Another young man who came in with multiple casualties had absolutely no external signs of injury. Yet he was dead when he arrived. In fact, he probably died immediately after the blast, as it would have been the blast wave itself that injured tissue inside his body. But it meant that it was impossible for his father to understand that his son was dead. Finally, we had a young man, a teenager, come through that would have been considered a child here. He looked upon himself as a man, and he was probably considered as such by his environment as well, until he was injured by shrapnel penetrating his stomach. He traveled for 2 days to get to us. He now had blast belly, and he was what they would call big sick, and he was no longer so big himself. The long travel times is one of the common denominators of many of the patients I've seen with explosive injuries. This young teenage boy was strong, and he survived against all odds. But the long travel times is why I've seen a disproportionately high number of blast injuries with injured limbs. It's because they're the only ones that survive to get to treatment. That's why I'm very glad to be part of the International Committee of the Red Cross's group trying to address this. And I'm very happy to see all this amazing expertise gathered here today to rally together to help avoid more casualties like Fahima and Mohammed in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Finnsnes, and thank you to you and your colleagues for your work, for giving victims of explosive ordnance a voice here, and for representing, I think, the impulse to prevent and respond to the impact of explosive ordnance contamination that I think motivates everybody in this room. So thank you very, very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from our opening speakers now this morning. We have a lot to discuss. We have over 700 participants registered to contribute to this hybrid event. And since our last meeting, I think we've really been able to observe our last meeting in person, of course, over 2 years ago. We've certainly observed how the mine action sector adapts, innovates, and delivers. During the pandemic, sustained clearance efforts have helped communities live in safer environments. We've seen innovation, we've seen creativity in explosive ordnance risk education, we've seen improved national commitment to victim assistance. And last but not least, we've seen that investments in strengthening national capacity continues to deliver returns. But we've also seen that, as Mr. Lacroix said, in countries with a UN presence, we've noted that casualties, including civilians and peacekeepers, in countries where the UN has a presence, we've recorded over 12,000 casualties in 2021 alone. And of course, civilians and especially children continue to be the most affected. As humanitarian needs rise exponentially, we report a gap, an unprecedented gap of 40.2 billion between humanitarian requirements and available funding. Our discussions in these 2 days will explore solutions to these challenges, enable us to exchange good practices, strengthen our partnerships. Our agenda, I'm really happy to say, has been developed through close consultations with all constituents here, including national directors in the margins of last year's meeting, the hybrid meeting that was hosted by Germany, listening sessions that we've conducted with numerous NGOs, and through a pre-meeting survey that I want to thank 20% of you for completing. So I'm confident that over the next 2 days, we're going to be discussing the issues that you've identified as the most relevant to our work. Now, Madame Valovaya has already mentioned the plenaries that will be taking place today and tomorrow. I remind you that this includes the Humanitarian Development and Peace Nexus, Information Management, Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, Explosive Ordnance Risk Education, including new technologies, and a final plenary tomorrow on mine action financing. Please contribute, everyone. I invite you to contribute actively, to bring your experience and ideas and proposals to the table. And with this, I'm going to close our opening ceremony with just a mention that this evening we'll be having an opening reception in the WIPO building. Of course, thank you again, Ambassador Baumann, for that. And we will close finally tomorrow at 4 p.m. with remarks from ASG SUEV, the ASG for Rule of Law and Security Institutions in the Department of Peace Operations in New York. Now, if you'll join me in giving all of the speakers a final round of applause, we'll draw the opening to a close. Thank you.